Who has absolutely amazing philosophy on life and someone I respect a lot. Welcome Farzam, Ehsani from Rand Merchant Bank.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you today. Thanks very much to the organizers for a wonderful lineup. I think the first couple of speakers were awesome. And I'll be saying a few things about the first speaker as well. So I am the first slot with a banking representative in front of you, and I look forward to that. Because I share a few similarities to what was expressed in the first talk and a few differences, which I'd like to explore with you. But I think the first thing to mention, and that is a theme throughout what everybody is talking about, is that we are in a time of change, a fundamental paradigm shift. Let's ask ourselves today where the Roman Empire is. Let's ask ourselves today where the Ottoman Empire is, where the Persian Empire is. These were the paragons of power in their time, and yet play no role in our societies today. And in fact, for those of you that were reading the news the last 24 hours with this new research that talked about the first evidence of life being discovered that points to life as old as 4.28 billion years ago on the planet Earth. And if you start thinking about that history, 4.28 billion years is quite unfathomable, actually. And then you think of our puny little lives and our tendency to look at our paradigms and subconsciously believe that they've existed before our time and they will continue to exist after our time. That's a great fallacy of human thinking. And I think the people in the room here are actually at the cutting edge and actually of understanding that that paradigm is changing, specifically to do with value and money and blockchain. One of the things I like to ask people is to think about their computers and think about your folder directory. And I ask them, well, you've got probably a folder for your music, folder for your movies, for your documents, maybe your Excel files. And why don't you have a folder for your money? Now, we understand, I think many of us in the room understand this concept of double spending and why we haven't been able to have folders or money in our folders only in the last few years with our private keys. But that's a fundamental shift of thinking about holding value on your computer. Now, talking about phones, I'd like to ask a question to the crowd, which is, this is an iPhone 7, and I don't want anybody to answer out loud, but I'd like you to answer the question of, what is the value of this phone? Just very quickly, the first thing that comes to your mind. What is the value of this phone? Okay, so hands up everybody that had a Rand value in their mind. Okay? Hands up everybody that had a dollar value in their mind? A Bitcoin value in their mind? That's very interesting. That's very interesting. And anything else? Any other answer? Okay, a couple. Okay, so there's probably about 10% that had something else, but most of us had either rands, the far majority was rands, and a few of us dollars, and one soul over there had a Bitcoin value. Now that speaks to our socialization of thinking about money in the way that we're taught and we're brought up as. Most of you, if I said, what are your thoughts about holding rands versus Bitcoin, most of you would probably said Bitcoin. I'll take Bitcoin over rands, right? But your thinking is still there. Now, I'd like you guys to try to explain to me or describe the value of this phone without referencing anything else. Is there any brave soul that can do that? Without referencing anything else. So not dollars, not rands, not... Yes? Time? Okay, but you're still referencing time. Okay, that's a good point. Yes?
The value depends on the use case. What you're using it for.
Sure. I think what I'm trying to say is that the only way humans can describe value is against something else. Normally we think about it in rands and dollars. Sometimes we think about it in time. But there is no way you would find it impossible to describe the value of this phone to me without referencing some other asset. And right now, when you guys think about your portfolios of value, whether it's rands or dollars, those rands or dollars form the basis of the way you evaluate your own wealth. But paradigms change. So if you valued your wealth in terms of Zimbabwean dollars, for example, and you bought some bread in the morning, you would probably think you're very rich by the evening because the price of your bread has gone up in terms of Zimbabwean dollars. Right? And if you kept holding it and you saw the price of that bread going up, you thought, wow, what a fantastic investment. Until such time that the base currency that you were measuring that bread in was no longer relevant. Until such time that you bought bread with your Zimbabwean dollars with the intent never ever to sell that bread again to retrieve Zimbabwean dollars because you felt it had no value. And therefore, money in that case stopped serving its purpose, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. So if we think about what money is, I think most of us would think about it in terms of two forms, physical and digital. Few of us realize that about 95% of money in the world, regardless of what currency you're talking about, is digital already. So it's a strange thing that most people haven't asked themselves why their computer that deals with digital things doesn't have money on it. But also, we'll come together a little bit later to talking about a third form of money, which is the crypto instrument or cryptocurrency. Now, this is something that you will all be familiar with. It's a textbook definition of the functions of money being the means of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. But all of these functions come down to value. The reason I say that as a means of exchange, why would I ever use it as a means of exchange and accept money if it didn't hold value? I wouldn't. Right? Why would I ever hold money as a store of value? It wouldn't. And then also, as a unit of account, I explained about the Zimbabwean dollar. It falls flat when it no longer has any value. So this idea of value is extremely important to start thinking about what it actually means in our societies. Now, something a little less familiar to people are what are the features of money? What makes money good money? And there are 6 things or 6 attributes that really one can test how effective money is. The first one is divisibility. That's simple enough. It needs to be divisible so that you can pay for the smallest things in society. The second is durable, easy enough. Fungible, all fungible means is that 100 rands equals 100 rands. Back in the day when you had cows, you couldn't quite say that 1 cow equaled 1 cow. It depended on how big the cow was, etc. So that was a difficult form of money to use. It needs to be portable. And then it needs to be scarce. This is critically important. There's a reason we don't use leaves as our monetary instruments. And then it needs to be accepted. Okay, you can have all of those first 5, but if it's not accepted, it doesn't perform very well as money. And we'll come back to evaluating some of the forms of money in society against these metrics. Now, I'd like to look back again at our history and look at money and an abridged timeline of money. And we did start with having cows as our money about 10,000 years ago, post the agricultural revolution. We quickly moved to other things like shells, like cowrie shells, and then animal hides and things like that. And then soon came to metals like gold. And gold was beautiful because it didn't rust and it was durable and it had many of the elements we've just talked about. And then we came to money, this thing of paper, which is very, very interesting. Because we exchanged some of our gold that you had to do like a lot of work for this thing called paper, which was really a liability of the issuer. And then in 1971, under Nixon, we decided not to have any backing of gold against that paper any longer. So when we think about what gives 100 rand its value, what gives it its value? And it's really just the collective faith of our society. We are all believers, whether we like it or not. Every time you accept 100 rand, you're a believer in its value. Otherwise, you would not accept it. So that's where we are today, once we've moved from that piece of paper to that digital liability. And what's critically important to understand right now is that it is impossible to hold money without taking what's called credit risk against an institution like a bank. You cannot hold digital money without taking credit risk. That's not great. That's really not great. Because I want to have money without taking the risk of someone defaulting on paying me that money. So this brings us to, obviously, blockchain and cryptocurrencies and the money of the future. But let's not fool ourselves that this is the last form of money. Because if we look at our history, and this is another fallacy of the human mind, is to think this is it. We've found the ultimate solution to everything. But this is the next step in our journey. First of all, I'd like to really actually just go back to the basics and actually talk about monetary value and how we assign it to each other in society. And there are only two ways. The first way is what we call a bearer instrument. Those cows, those shells, those coins, and that cash are bearer instruments. They're in physical form, and the holder is presumed to be the owner. You're not asked to prove ownership of your 100 rands every time you take it out of your wallet to pay at the shop. And no records are kept of how it transfers in society. Now, this is juxtaposed to what we call registered instruments, your property today, your car, digital money, bonds and equities. All of those are registered instruments. That means they are in physical or digital form. There is a record of ownership that determines who the owner is. And as society, we do have a trusted intermediary, whether they're trusted or not, we'll talk about. But we place our trust in them to update that ledger on our behalf. There is no other way in which any human being or institution can hold monetary value. It's either a bearer instrument or a registered instrument. Now, when you talk about money, money straddles both of these things. The 100 rands in your pocket, again, a bearer instrument. As soon as you put that physical bearer instrument and you take it to the bank, it gets converted into a digital registered instrument. And so, whereas before, when it was in your pocket, everybody would recognize it because they recognize that rand, if something happens to the institution you deposited it with, then obviously you don't have that. You can fight it in a court of law to get it, but you don't have it if they say you don't have it. So, that's the bank there. Now, in 2009, we know the digital bearer instrument was born. I'm not going to talk too much about Bitcoin itself in this context, but it is important to look at that trend. So, if we start with physical bearer instruments, we see that's how society dealt with physical value, or with value in general. But then we realized as human beings that certain things were not good as bearer instruments, And what I mean by that is think about land. If land was a bearer instrument, and whoever was standing on the piece of land owned that piece of land, then that wouldn't promote an ever-advancing civilization. If I wanted to go out and hunt, and I came back, and someone was standing on my land, and they say, hey, buddy, this is a bearer instrument, it's mine, then we would either have some conflict, or I would walk away, or I would be incentivized to stay on my land, none of which are very good for society. So registered instruments aren't bad things. They do serve their purpose. Those physical registered instruments then went on to digital registered instruments, registers, and the fact that we could have digital registers meant we could now have digital instruments. And it's really interesting that most of the money in this room is on a server somewhere that determines how wealthy we are, how much of the world's resources we can command with that wealth. But it's a figment of our imagination, a collective societal norm that we agree whoever has the most bits, say, and not even the most bits, but basically the highest form of value on that digital register is now entitled to a lot of power in our society. It's kind of strange when you think about it. Now, ultimately, we've come to this place of having a digital bearer instrument. Now, I call it a digital bearer instrument. It's not really a digital bearer instrument like Bitcoin. It's actually a digital hybrid instrument. It has characteristics of a bearer instrument, which is the private key that you hold entitles you to the value at that public address. But there's also a register. It just happens that that register is just distributed over thousands of nodes. But if there was no node, there would be no register and there would be no value. So it's a hybrid of the two. Now, again, if you think about money, we went from the physical to the digital registered, and then finally to this digital bearer, this digital hybrid, that has huge ramifications of our financial system. And we'll come to that in a few moments. All right, so let's talk a little bit about banking. What is banking? And I think I'd like to say at this point, and I'd like to impress upon the audience here, progress is always achieved through unity. Say that again. Progress is achieved through unity. And why I say that is that there is a trend that I've seen in which there's a dichotomy between the bankers and the non-bankers. And the bankers are evil, and everybody else is good. I'd like to say that's not true. And actually, there are many people in banks that are trying to do good for society, and there are many people out of banks that are not trying to do so well for society. So this dichotomy actually isn't a helpful discourse to have for us. And also, furthermore, we talked a little bit earlier about kind of trying to improve, operating margins of banks. And we kind of squandered that. How many of you are trying to improve your balance sheet? How many of you are trying to increase your salary every year? Right? So why aren't we scorning at that? I mean, what is such a bad thing about trying to increase your operating return? Now, my point is not saying that it's actually a good thing. I actually think that society has gone a little bit over the edge with thinking that the promotion of self-interest that is unbridled leads to prosperity for all. I think we're realizing that that is not the case. But it's not because of the banks. It's because of our system. Our capitalistic system, I think we're starting to realize the aggregation and the accumulation of wealth in and of itself doesn't bode well for society at large. So to evaluate one single industry against that metric that we all measure ourselves on is a little bit of a fallacious thinking. So let's go back to banking. That was a little bit of a side note. What is banking? And if we think about it, it's actually quite simple. Banks are in the value business. We deal with value. We either transfer value, we store it, we provide it, and we protect it. Nothing more, nothing less. Realize I'm not saying rands, I'm not saying dollars, I'm saying value. All right? And these intermediaries of society have existed for yonks. Right? Now, if we think about what the blockchain world and what cryptocurrencies may do to this industry, it's actually quite phenomenal, and it's actually very, very exciting. The first thing is this value transfer business. If we think about transferring value, and we think, talking about the operating profits of banks and their revenues, let's say, $1.8 trillion is generated to the banking industry worldwide for payments. That represents 33% of total banking revenue. Now, for any of you that have actually made a transfer abroad, you will know that it's not the cheapest thing going through a bank. And using your Bitcoin, your cryptocurrency, your Ether, whatever it may be, you can do it much, much more efficiently and much, much cheaper. That is fantastic for society. Fantastic for society. And what that means is the revenue models and the models of banking of the past cannot be sustainable. When we were able to send email quickly and instantaneously, although that was a really interesting example from Andreas about his first email in 1989, that changed the game for written communication forevermore. This has changed the game for value transfer forevermore. There is no question about that. So is this a threat? Absolutely it's a threat. And we'll talk about central banks in a moment. But is it an opportunity? It's absolutely an opportunity. And I think we get stuck sometimes in this world of this crypto world about talking about trust and how it's a bad thing. I'd like to challenge that. Trust is not a bad thing. The betrayal of trust is a bad thing. But trust is a wonderful thing. And in fact, all of us trust someone. And if we did not trust anyone, we wouldn't be able to survive in our society. And when we talk about Bitcoin, I love Bitcoin, please do not get me wrong. But we live in dichotomies in our society. We talk about, on the one hand, economic growth and how we need to stimulate economic growth. And how do we need to stimulate economic growth? We need to produce more, we need to consume more. And on the other hand, we say, geez, our environment's in trouble. Let's preserve our forests. Let's stop cutting the trees down. But that sounds kind of schizophrenic. And so when I look at the Bitcoin network, which is a beautiful thing, and I look at its consensus algorithm, And I see proof of work is not the most cheap consensus algorithm in the world. I understand it because I say, you know what? There is a crisis of governance in our societies at large. And when there's a crisis of governance and people don't trust our government's institutions, our institutions of governance, it is no wonder that they will pay a price to avoid that untrusted, meant to be trusted institution or institutions globally. But in the long term, if there is a way that we could do exactly the same thing and have the functionality of what we're aiming for, but we could do it cheaper, only by introducing a little bit of trust, why would we never consider that? So the opportunity as well for banks, as I was saying, is that there is this whole idea of separate ledgers being reconciled is really pretty crazy. Right? So one of the beauties about blockchain technology is actually just getting a single ledger, but redistributing it out. And I agree with a lot that was said. That doesn't need to even be a block. It doesn't need to be a blockchain necessarily. But the beauty of that thing is actually having a single ledger and having different people control different parts of that ledger, which we've never been able to do before. One ledger equaled one institution. No longer. It's a very powerful concept. So now I'd like to talk about our identity as a human race, as an individual, as a society, and what that means for money going forward. If we look back in time, we were composed as families, as society. And those families feuded. But there was a time that families put aside their differences to form tribes. And believe you me, there were people in those families that said, why will I ever join forces with that family? We just fought with them, last week, 2 weeks, or whatever it was. But they put aside their differences and they formed tribes. These tribes feuded. They set aside their differences. They formed city-states. City-states feuded. They at some point set aside their differences and created the nation-state. And the nation-state, as we know it today, was established in about the 1600s. It's attributed to the Conference of Westphalia in Germany, where this concept of the nation-state really came up. And this paradigm is 400 years old. And it's getting old. And it's getting unuseful. Yet our governance institutions are limited by this societal paradigm. We don't really have international institutions that have any teeth today. We have the United Nations, we have the World Bank and guys like that. And they're doing great things, but at the end of the day, the power doesn't lie in their hands. The highest level of power is at the nation state. And again, we think that this is it, and we need to solve within this paradigm. But what I'm proposing to you is that a world and global federation of nations is not only possible, but it is inevitable. This will happen. It is a matter of time. Whether it's orderly or disorderly is a completely different question. And I think if we look around the world today and we see what's going on in our society, bets are probably more in favor of a disorderly resolution to our present status quo. Okay? And we've seen in the last few years things like Brexit and Trump and all these things that people like talking about. People are rebelling about this globalization and they're taking a step back. But I say, listen, if you're having, you want to go back to having bilateral agreements between countries, why stop there? Go back to the city-state. Let's have bilateral agreements between London and Manchester. Let's go back into the neighborhood. It's a completely arbitrary state that we're in right now, which is the nation state. And there's a lot of power in that unity. Now, why have I taken the time to explain this to you? Because when you think about money today, take the rands that most of you use today, that is restricted to a little plot of earth we call South Africa right now. The almighty dollar, the almighty US dollar, the reserve currency of the world. I've got some in my pocket right now. If I take it to Woolworths or Pick n Pay, will they accept it? No, not at all. It's a strange thing, this thing. That money, that's such a powerful concept, is restricted to an arbitrary piece of land that's a man-made, that's defined by a man-made border. The beauty about cryptocurrencies and things like Bitcoin is that it takes no cognizance of those man-made and obsolete doctrines. It transcends it. It doesn't care, as we heard earlier. It doesn't care who you are, where you are. And what that means is that the current institutions, whether you're banks or central banks, you need to be very aware as to what is happening on a global scale. And the reason I say that is that banks are not the only ones that are at threat. Central banks are also under threat. If we look at cryptocurrencies and we look at those 6 characteristics that we talked about, those 6 features of money, I thought let's just do a little exercise and see those different forms of money that are representative of our monetary value history and kind of plot these features of money against them. So if we look at divisibility, I think we can quickly agree that the first 3, cows and shells and gold coins, are not the most divisible things in the world. Okay? 100 rands, not also divisible, but it's kind of divisible. Then rands, it is divisible, and Bitcoin is divisible. Now you could say it's much more divisible, but it doesn't really make a difference for our purposes, whether it's 8 decimal places or 2 decimal places. Now let's take a look at durability. Durability, we see that gold is very strong. We see that money, digital money, is stronger. I would say that cryptocurrencies, and I use Bitcoin there, by the way, just as a general image for cryptocurrencies in general. Very strong as far as durability is concerned. If we look at fungibility, then really the first 3 weren't very fungible. It takes a lot of time to determine whether one gold coin is actually gold, etc. And if we look at portability, we see that digital money was pretty portable, and these are relative things, but cryptocurrencies are way more portable, being transferred across the world in a matter of seconds or minutes. Scarcity. Now, this is a very interesting thing. And you'll see that gold is pretty scarce and Bitcoin is pretty scarce. The other forms are not. Now, I talked about us going off the gold standard in 1971. Does anybody remember what the gold price was in 1971 in terms of dollars? It was $35. Okay? Now, let's think about this, because 46 years later, right now, when we talked about value, one thing versus another, did you know that the dollar, the US dollar, has lost 98% of its value against gold? Now that's a powerful thing. The almighty dollar has lost 98% of its value against gold. Primarily because it's not scarce. We think it's scarce, but it's not really scarce. And if you look at the balance sheet of the central bank of the US, it's been growing a lot since 2008 specifically. And this is a trend that we see with with central banks across the world. Our paradigm of central banking is no different to our paradigm of money. The fact that we have central bankers in the world talking about unconventional monetary policy means that conventional monetary policy is no longer working. Otherwise, why would we be talking about unconventional monetary policy? Now, this is no fault of central bankers. I have no idea. If I were in the central bank, I wouldn't know what to do. And I also don't think central bankers are evil people. All right? I think central bankers are doing the best that they can within the constraints that are presented to them. Now, if we look at acceptability, this last thing, we see that really today, that, again, depending on where you are physically, your piece of paper that we call money and your digital money is accepted depending on your geography. And I've grayed out that acceptability of cryptocurrencies. But that last thing of acceptability is a function of those first 5. And if you look at those first 5, things are changing quickly. And that grayed out tick at the top there for cryptocurrencies will very soon become solid black. Did you know that even in South Africa, many of you maybe have gone and taken your blood tests at Lancet Laboratories? They accept Bitcoin. The kids, for those of you that have kids, Narchi, the clothing store, accepts Bitcoin. All right? Takealot accepts Bitcoin. Now, in a world of finance, where there is a lot of revenues that are derived from the inefficiencies between using two different types of currencies and two different jurisdictions, I would love to have my revenues in the same denomination as my costs. I could avoid a whole hedging industry, right? And more we're seeing we are transcending this nation state that we're talking about, and we're really looking at the world as a global family. So I'll stop there and leave time for questions, but I'd really like to leave you with this thought that our power lies in unity. And that unity is as a human race, regardless of religion, regardless of nation state, regardless of whether you're pro or against Ether or Dash or Bitcoin, etc. But this idea of the oneness of humanity is very powerful. And those systems and those organizations that take this view will be successful in the future. And those systems that have a very parochial view will not be as successful. So I'll pause there and thank you very much for listening.
I told you it's very different for a banker. Any questions?
Hi.
Hi.
That was a very enlightening presentation. You spoke of the Zim dollar.
Yes.
If your life depended on it, I think you know what's happening right now in Zimbabwe. They're printing the bond note.
Yeah.
What kind of solution would you come up with right now, in line with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, etc., for the current situation right now in Zimbabwe?
So it depends if you ask me as a regulator or as an individual.
Both.
Okay. I certainly wouldn't venture to say that I have answers. I see issues and I try to be a part of the answer. Our economics and our economic system and paradigm is a very interesting one. We had difficulties in the 1930s because of our gold standard, and we felt that, deflation wasn't a good thing, and so we went on to another type of monetary standard where we said, listen, let's make sure that we as society make sure that our money gets devalued every year. And what I mean by that is every economy in the world right now in a regulatory perspective sees inflation as a good thing and deflation as a bad thing, right? We talk about how Japan has struggled with the deflation. We're worried about the Eurozone and them going into deflation. But what does that mean? What it actually means is that the money in my pocket, when it becomes less valuable, we seem to be happy, because that means inflation is taking place. And when the money in my pocket is becoming more valuable, we seem to be unhappy because there's an economic theory that states that I will hoard my money and I will not spend it, and by not spending it, it's not good for society. Right? At the same token, when computer prices go down every year and there's a deflation in computer prices, we don't complain about those things going down, and we still buy computers. So I think our paradigm right now is going to be tested on all sorts of fronts: social, economic, you name it, political. I don't need to talk about the political front, but globally. So for Zimbabwe specifically, as an individual, I would try to look at those characteristics that I was talking about and say, what holds those characteristics well? I think Bitcoin is a great alternative right now. Unfortunately, Bitcoin is still not accepted, but there are many exchanges in the world that do that service for you. You pay a fee, and I think there's nothing wrong with fees. But I am concerned with things like bond notes, because I think that they don't serve the interests of the people at large. And when that happens, I get concerned.
Great question over here. Nizam, Mike, just in front of the poll. Thanks very much.
Hi, and thank you again for another great presentation.
Thank you.
So in my mind, the societal value of any instrument for intermediation is not the value relative to another currency or the value of what it can buy, whether the dollar is 90% depreciated against the dollars. It's less important from a policy perspective. but the value of an instrument of intermediation is the extent to which it increases overall societal well-being. So, we might decide from a policy perspective to devalue the rand so that our exports becomes more competitive. So that's not important. So my question is, how, in your mind, would Bitcoin increase the value to society over the current intermediation instruments?
Sure. Thank you for that. That's a great question. So I'd like to question one of your assumptions in that question. Because you said that we may choose to devalue the rand so that we can enhance exports, right? And stimulate our economy. There's a lot loaded in that question. And effectively what you're saying is that we as South Africans are trying to do better in the world against others. It's effectively what that question says. And by the way, it's not a funny question. Everybody's asking that question. But all I'm trying to say is I think that question is obsolete. When we start looking at man-made historical patterns of communities that have come together and we try to advance their interests over other human beings, we land up in a world that looks kind of like what we see around us today. So while I hear you and I say, well, we want to devalue, that would be a very strange question if we said, listen, let's go to KZN, because KZN's economy is not doing so well. Let's create another currency there. Let's devalue it against Gauteng so that people in KZN can do better.
Sorry, the question is not around the devaluing of currency. The question is, how would blockchain increase societal value as an instrument for intermediation over the existing instruments?
I'm coming to that. So the reason I say that to you is that blockchain right now in the unregulated space, in cryptocurrencies, the value is that I can transact much quicker than any traditional system can provide me. It's much quicker, it's much cheaper. So in that case, why would I use a traditional system? Am I a supporter of traditional systems for the sake of traditional systems? Of course not. Right? We're all trying to advance. Humans' aspiration is to grow and to develop. And so when I see those characteristics, and the reason I bring up that stuff about nation states is because right now, if we try to have a regulated blockchain around the world that does the same thing in these unregulated cryptocurrencies, I would venture to tell you right now, given our governance structures, it is impossible. Would China and the US and South Africa and Russia come onto the same blockchain? If so, what would their consensus algorithm be? Would it be trust? Because I don't think those actors trust each other very well right now. Would it be proof of work? I don't think so either, because the people that have the most resources, probably China, if they wanted to impose economic sanctions on South Africa, could just stop processing the validation of those transactions and cripple the economy. So why would South Africa do that? No, they wouldn't do that. So right now, and that's what I'm saying, it's a call to actually understand our system. I don't have the answers for it, but what I can tell you is our current system is not sustainable. And so to answer your question just succinctly at the end, is that it serves humans better today versus the alternative.
So who's got the mic at the moment? Sorry, just one behind you, and then another one, blue shirt in front of the pole.
Thanks for your talk. Your positive view on human nature is inspiring. Let's leave it at that. So you mentioned, well, your opinion was that if it makes the system more efficient, it does not hurt to add trust to it. Would you mind clarifying that and put into context in your view on blockchains? Because in my opinion, it's that makes the blockchain irrelevant because it adds inefficiencies that you don't need once you have a system that does have forms of trust.
Sure. Thanks for that question. So there is this, as I referred to it a little bit, in certain parts of the crypto world, there's this anarchic element that says, we don't need regulation, we don't need trust. And I think that's so short-sighted. And the reason is that the reason that we can walk around the room today and the town and society unarmed is because we trust that there are punitive actions to those that don't abide by that social norm. Okay, so if there was anarchy, and I'm not saying that you're suggesting that, I'm just addressing another side of the spectrum, then it wouldn't be a good thing. Now, I'd like to use a very simple example of traffic lights. Traffic lights are laws, they're regulations, and we trust them. When it's green, we go. When it's red, we stop. And in fact, when that regulation stops, and there is no traffic light because there's whatever, it's out for whatever reason, we complain bitterly. And so I think it's a very fine point that actually humanity's liberation is actually allowed by societal norms and regulations. And so if we think that liberty is just let me do whatever I want anytime. But if you think about that silly example of traffic lights, I think we all know that society functions better when certain people stop when they should be stopping and they go when they should be going. So trust, right now, as I said, when we look at our government institutions and our very political systems, we see that they aren't serving us very well. So it's like that traffic light now that it's showing green on both sides and people are colliding. Of course you would stop trusting traffic lights. Of course you would say, I'm not going to abide by whether they say red. But maybe the solution is not let's get rid of traffic lights. Maybe the solution is let's make the traffic lights work. So that's
Okay, we're going to take the very last one. We're 2 minutes over. You're good. Farzam, thank you very much. Very enlightening. Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Good. Okay.